a biased and racist teacher, a student determined to rise above, and a classroom charged with silent tensions. What begins as subtle dismissals and microaggressions soon builds to a dramatic confrontation that no one could have anticipated. In this powerful story, the hidden biases lurking in the corners of an ordinary classroom are laid bare, exposing the truth about systemic discrimination. Get ready for a tale of quiet resilience, sharp injustice, and an unforgettable twist that will leave you questioning what truly happens in the spaces meant to nurture learning and growth. The bell echoed through the halls of Westfield High, its sharp ring signaling the start of another school day. Inside room 204, the English classroom buzzed with the low hum of students settling into their seats. The walls, adorned with inspirational quotes from classic authors, stood in stark contrast to the undercurrent of unease that hung in the air. It wasn't spoken, but it was palpable, an unshakable tension that permeated the room. Leah Anderson stood in the doorway, her backpack slung over one shoulder. Her tailored uniform and poised demeanor exuded confidence, but her sharp brown eyes held a quiet vigilance. This wasn't her first new school, and she had learned long ago to read a room within moments of entering. She saw the curious glances from her peers, a mix of interest and hesitation. She saw the subtle shift in body language as some students leaned away. She even noticed the teacher's reaction, a fleeting tightness in her lips quickly masked by a thin smile. "Ah, you must be Leah Anderson," said Miss Margaret Hayes, her voice clipped and overly polished. The teacher, a middle-aged woman with perfectly coiffed hair and glasses perched on the tip of her nose, straightened her posture and gestured toward an empty seat near the back. "Welcome to Westfield High. I hope you'll find our curriculum rigorous." The way she emphasized the last word gave Leah pause. She had heard it before, that thinly veiled tone that suggested skepticism rather than genuine encouragement. Leah nodded politely, her chin held high as she made her way to the desk. The moment her bag hit the floor, the class's hum stilled and all eyes were on her. She felt the weight of their stares but met them head-on, her calm exterior betraying none of the unease she felt. "Everyone, this is Leah Anderson. She'll be joining us for the rest of the semester," Miss Hayes announced. "I trust you'll make her feel comfortable." There was that pause again, like the word itself was a stretch for her. The silence lingered awkwardly before Miss Hayes clapped her hands together and turned to the board. "Let's get started, shall we? Today we'll begin our analysis of To Kill a Mockingbird." Leah's pulse quickened. The choice of text wasn't lost on her. She had read the novel before, appreciated its nuance, and understood the complexities of discussing race in a classroom setting. But here, in this space with this teacher, she couldn't help but wonder how the conversation would unfold. As Miss Hayes began summarizing the themes, Leah listened carefully. She couldn't help but notice the teacher's overly formal tone, her effort to sanitize the discussion. Words like racial tensions and injustice were spoken delicately, almost reluctantly. Leah raised an eyebrow but kept quiet. The soft hum of the classroom was interrupted by the scratch of Miss Hayes's marker on the whiteboard as she wrote, "Themes in To Kill a Mockingbird," in bold, precise letters. Leah Anderson sat at her desk, her notebook open and pen poised. She had read the novel before and found it profound, if imperfect, in its handling of race and justice. She was eager to engage in the discussion, but an undercurrent of tension ran through the air, a product of Miss Hayes's carefully measured demeanor. "Now," Miss Hayes began, turning to face the class, "who can tell me about the significance of the mockingbird in this story?" Leah's hand went up almost instinctively. She had been waiting for this moment, her mind brimming with ideas about the symbolic weight of the mockingbird as a representation of innocence and the societal consequences of injustice. But Miss Hayes's gaze swept over her as though she were invisible. "Yes, Matthew?" Miss Hayes called on a boy seated 2 rows over. Matthew hesitated before giving a textbook answer. It represents innocence, like, how you shouldn't harm someone who hasn't done anything wrong." "Correct," Miss Hayes said with an approving nod. "The mockingbird symbolizes innocence and purity." "Excellent point." Leah lowered her hand, her lips pressing into a thin line. It was the second time this week that Miss Hayes had overlooked her. She reminded herself to stay calm. The discussion moved forward, but Leah noticed how Miss Hayes's focus shifted away whenever she raised her hand. Finally, during a pause in the conversation, Leah interjected, her voice measured but confident. I think the mockingbird also symbolizes systemic injustice. Atticus says it's a sin to kill a mockingbird, but the novel shows how society fails to protect those who are vulnerable, like Tom Robinson. Miss Hayes paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. An interesting thought, Leah, she said, her tone teetering between condescension and dismissal. But I think you're leaning too much into modern interpretations. Let's stick to what the text actually says. Leah blinked. But the text? Miss Hayes held up a hand to stop her. Let's move on. We don't want to overcomplicate things for the rest of the class. A ripple of unease passed through the room. Some students exchanged uncomfortable glances, but no one spoke up. Leah felt the sting of the dismissal, but forced herself to keep her expression neutral. She took a deep breath and focused on her notebook, jotting down the points she wanted to revisit later. The discussion continued, and Leah noticed a pattern. Miss Hayes often praised other students for surface-level observations, but interrupted Leah whenever she tried to delve deeper into the novel's themes. During one exchange, Leah pointed out the parallels between Maycomb's justice system and contemporary issues, only for Miss Hayes to shake her head slightly and say, "Let's not get overly political, Leah. This is literature, not a debate." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. A couple of students in the back snickered, and Leah felt her cheeks flush. She clenched her pen tightly, refusing to let the moment break her. As the week wore on, the microaggressions continued. Miss Hayes would nitpick Leah's grammar during her responses, despite letting other students' mistakes slide. She would ask Leah to clarify her points, often in a tone that suggested her ideas were incoherent or unfounded. During group activities, Miss Hayes seemed to take a particular interest in monitoring Leah's contributions, hovering nearby and offering unsolicited critiques. "Leah," Miss Hayes said one day during a writing exercise, her voice dripping with exaggerated politeness, "you might want to focus more on clarity. Your last essay was a bit unfocused." Leah stared at her, a flush rising in her cheeks. She had spent hours on that essay, ensuring it was structured and supported with evidence. "I'll review it," she replied tersely, biting back the retort that threatened to slip out. Other students began to take notice. Sarah, who sat a row ahead, shot Leah sympathetic glances during class. After one particularly cutting remark from Miss Hayes, she leaned over and whispered, "Don't let her get to you. She's just like that." But not all students were sympathetic. A group of boys at the back of the room seemed to take cues from Miss Hayes, mimicking her behavior in subtle but cruel ways. When Leah answered questions, they would smirk or mutter under their breath. One afternoon, after Leah had presented her analysis of a key scene, one of the boys remarked loudly, "Guess we know who's trying too hard." Leah's jaw tightened, but she ignored them. She had endured worse before, and she wouldn't let them see her falter. Still, the steady stream of hostility took its toll. By the end of the week, Leah felt emotionally drained. After class one day, Miss Hayes stopped Leah as she was gathering her things. "Leah," she said, her voice laced with false concern, "I want to make sure you're not feeling overwhelmed. I know our curriculum can be demanding." "I'm managing fine, thank you," Leah replied evenly, meeting Miss Hayes's gaze without flinching. "Good, good," Miss Hayes said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "I do hope you'll find our discussions engaging. Just remember, we value thoughtful, well-reasoned contributions here." The implication wasn't lost on Leah. She nodded once, tight-lipped, and left the room. Outside, the hallway bustled with students moving between classes. Leah paused, taking a deep breath to steady herself. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "You're going to face people who judge you before they know you. It's not fair, but it's reality. Hold your head high, and let your work speak for itself." Leah adjusted her backpack and walked toward her next class, her steps purposeful. She had no intention of letting Miss Hayes or anyone else define her worth. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she was ready to face them. The classroom buzzed with restless energy as Miss Hayes stood at the front, a thin smile curling her lips. The students of Westfield High's English class had grown accustomed to the undercurrent of tension that hummed through their lessons, but today, It felt especially sharp. The whiteboard bore a single phrase in bold, looping letters: "Justice and Power, a Literary Analysis." "Today," Miss Hayes began, her clipped tone demanding attention, "we'll start a group project exploring themes of justice and power in literature, particularly as they relate to To Kill a Mockingbird. I'll be assigning your groups as this ensures a more equitable distribution of talent." Her eyes lingered on Leah Anderson for a fraction too long, a subtle but unmistakable signal. Leah sat stiffly in her chair, already bracing herself. The faint scrape of a pen against her notebook was her only movement, but inside, her mind churned with frustration. She knew Miss Hayes well enough now to sense when a lesson was less about education and more about making a point, often at Leah's expense. Miss Hayes began calling out group assignments, her voice carrying an edge of authority. "Anderson, Peterson, and Mills," she announced, her gaze flicking briefly to Leah before moving on. Leah sighed inwardly. Marcus Peterson was a quiet student who often avoided controversy, and Olivia Mills, seated near the window, was one of the teacher's more vocal allies, frequently echoing Miss Hayes's dismissive remarks in class discussions. This pairing wasn't random, it was calculated. As students shuffled into their assigned groups, Leah gathered her things and approached her table with calm determination. Marcus offered a hesitant smile, but Olivia greeted her with an air of reluctant politeness, her posture rigid and unwelcoming. Miss Hayes walked around the room, her heels clicking with purpose as she monitored the groups. When she approached Leah's table, she stopped, tilting her head with feigned curiosity. "Well," she said, her voice overly sweet, "this should be an interesting group dynamic. Miss Anderson, I hope you'll remember that the focus of this project is literary analysis, not personal politics." Leah's grip on her pen tightened, but she didn't take the bait. Instead, she met Miss Hayes's gaze steadily. "Of course, Miss Hayes," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "I'm looking forward to exploring the text's themes." Miss Hayes gave a tight smile. "Good. Let's make sure your interpretation doesn't stray too far from the author's intent." Leah's group was tasked with examining the trial of Tom Robinson, a centerpiece of To Kill a Mockingbird, and a moment rich with themes of justice and power. As they began to brainstorm ideas, Olivia quickly took control, her tone clipped and dismissive. "I think we should focus on Atticus Finch," Olivia said, her pen already darting across her notebook. "He's the real hero, after all. His courage in defending Tom Robinson is the heart of the story." Leah raised an eyebrow. "Atticus is important, but the trial also highlights systemic racism and the power imbalance in the justice system. Don't you think we should discuss that too?" Olivia frowned, her tone sharpening. "That's not really the point of the story. It's about one man standing up for what's right, not some modern political commentary." Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing between the two. "Maybe we can include both perspectives?" he offered, clearly trying to diffuse the tension. Leah nodded, keeping her voice measured. "Exactly. We can talk about Atticus's role while also acknowledging the bigger picture, the social structures that made the trial so unjust in the first place." But Olivia wasn't convinced. "I think focusing on that will make our project too divisive. Miss Hayes probably wouldn't like it." "Miss Hayes," Leah said carefully, "isn't the only audience for this project. We're supposed to analyze the text thoroughly, and that means addressing all the themes, not just the ones we're comfortable with." Their discussion continued, but the division in their approach was clear. Olivia clung to her narrow interpretation, while Leah worked methodically to integrate a broader, more nuanced perspective. Marcus, caught in the middle, contributed sparingly, his discomfort evident. By the next class, the groups were expected to present their progress. As Leah and her teammates took their place at the front of the room, Miss Hayes leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed. "Go ahead," she said, her tone almost dismissive. "Let's see what you've come up with." Leah began to speak, her voice steady as she outlined their analysis of the trial scene. She discussed the courage of Atticus Finch, weaving in the broader societal implications of the trial's outcome. But as soon as she touched on the themes of systemic racism and institutional power, Miss Hayes interrupted. "Miss Anderson," she said, her tone cutting, "while your points are interesting, they seem to deviate from the novel's core message. Do you think perhaps you're overinterpreting the text?" Leah paused, choosing her words carefully. "I don't believe so, Miss Hayes. Harper Lee herself described the novel as a critique of racial injustice and—" Miss Hayes raised a hand, silencing her. "Let's not get lost in conjecture. Stick to the text, please." The room was silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. Leah glanced at her classmates, some of whom looked away, unwilling to meet her gaze. Others, like Olivia, wore expressions of quiet satisfaction. Leah swallowed her frustration, refusing to let it show. "Of course, Miss Hayes," she said evenly. "We'll refine our analysis to ensure it aligns more closely with the text." Miss Hayes gave a tight nod. "See that you do." That evening, Leah sat at her desk, her notes spread out before her. The weight of the day lingered, but so did her resolve. She wasn't just working on a school project anymore. She was challenging a narrative, one that sought to silence voices like hers. She poured her energy into the project, crafting a presentation that was both insightful and meticulously researched. If Miss Hayes wanted a focus on the text, Leah would give her exactly that, supported by historical context, scholarly analysis, and evidence that couldn't be dismissed. Nina, her younger sister, poked her head into the room. "You've been at this for hours," she said, concern in her voice. "Everything okay?" Leah looked up, offering a small smile. "Yeah, just making sure I get it right." Nina hesitated, then stepped inside. "You always get it right. Don't let her make you think otherwise." Leah's smile grew, her sister's words bolstering her resolve. "Thanks, Nina. I've got this." By the time she finished her work, the tension in her chest had eased. She knew the presentation wouldn't just be about earning a grade. It would be her quiet way of asserting her voice, of refusing to be silenced. The next morning, Leah walked into the classroom with her head held high. She set up her materials, her heart steady as she prepared to face both her peers and Miss Hayes. This wasn't just a test of knowledge, it was a test of will, and Leah was ready. The classroom buzzed with quiet anticipation as students shuffled in, setting up their materials for the day's group project presentations. The phrase, "justice and power, a literary analysis," remained prominently displayed on the board, a silent reminder of the theme that had stirred tension throughout the week. Leah Anderson sat at her desk, her posture calm, but her eyes sharp with focus. She was ready. Miss Hayes stood near her desk, glancing at the lineup of presentations with an air of disinterest. Her heels clicked against the floor as she moved toward the front of the room. "Let's get started," she said, her tone clipped. "Anderson's group, you're first." Leah, Marcus, and Olivia rose from their seats, their materials in hand. As they approached the front of the class, Miss Hayes settled into her chair, arms crossed, and a faint smirk tugging at her lips. Leah could feel the teacher's gaze burning into her, but she refused to let it shake her. She had spent countless hours preparing for this moment. Olivia opened the presentation with a summary of the trial in To Kill a Mockingbird, focusing on Atticus Finch's courage. Her voice was steady, but her analysis felt shallow, lacking the depth that Leah knew the project deserved. When it was Leah's turn to speak, she stepped forward with confidence, her heart steady despite the weight of the moment. "Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird doesn't just explore the bravery of one man," Leah began, her voice clear and measured. "It critiques an entire system of racial injustice that denies people like Tom Robinson their humanity. The trial symbolizes the imbalance of power, where justice is skewed by the prejudice of those who wield it." As Leah spoke, she wove together textual evidence and historical context, citing passages from the book that underscored systemic racism and connecting them to real-world events of the time. Her points were insightful and meticulously researched, presenting the novel's themes with a clarity that resonated deeply. But before she could finish her thought, Miss Hayes interrupted, her voice sharp. "Miss Anderson, while your enthusiasm is noted, you seem to be taking liberties with the text. Perhaps you're letting your personal biases cloud your analysis? A murmur rippled through the classroom and Leah's jaw tightened. She met Miss Hayes's gaze steadily, refusing to back down. I don't believe my analysis is biased, Miss Hayes. Harper Lee explicitly addresses racial injustice through Tom Robinson's trial. Ignoring that would overlook one of the novel's central themes. Miss Hayes's smirk deepened, her tone dripping with condescension. Let's not confuse context with conjecture, Miss Anderson. This is a literature class, not a platform for political grandstanding. Leah took a slow breath, grounding herself. With respect, Miss Hayes, the themes in To Kill a Mockingbird are inherently political. The novel forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about society. To avoid discussing them would be a disservice to the text. The tension in the room was palpable. Some students exchanged glances, their discomfort with Miss Hayes's treatment of Leah evident. Others sat frozen, unsure whether to intervene. Marcus fidgeted beside Leah, his face tight with unease, while Olivia avoided eye contact altogether. Leah continued, her voice unwavering despite the interruptions. Take, for example, the passage where Atticus explains to Scout why it's a sin to kill a mockingbird. The symbolism is clear. It represents the innocence destroyed by injustice. Tom Robinson is the mockingbird. Miss Hayes cut her off again, her tone icy. That's enough, Miss Anderson. Let's move on. It's clear you're passionate about this topic, but perhaps you've missed the broader literary merits. Before Leah could respond, the classroom door opened quietly, drawing everyone's attention. Mr. Julian Carter, the school principal, stepped inside. His presence was commanding yet calm, his tailored suit and confident posture exuding authority. He glanced briefly at the students, then at Miss Hayes, who faltered slightly at the sight of him. "Good morning, Miss Hayes," Mr. Carter said smoothly. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Miss Hayes quickly masked her surprise, offering a tight smile. "Not at all, Mr. Carter. We're in the middle of presentations." "Excellent," he replied, taking a seat at the back of the room. "Please continue. I'd love to observe." Miss Hayes's unease was almost palpable, but she nodded curtly. "Of course." Leah resumed her presentation, her composure unwavering despite the added scrutiny. As she delved into the nuances of racial power dynamics in the novel, Miss Hayes interrupted yet again, her voice laced with impatience. "Miss Anderson, while your interpretation is creative, it seems you're struggling to stay within the bounds of literary analysis." The tension in the room reached its breaking point. A few students shifted uncomfortably, and Sarah, a quiet classmate, raised her hand hesitantly. "Actually, I think Leah's points make sense. The book is about more than just Atticus's bravery. It's about the whole system that allowed Tom Robinson to be convicted." Miss Hayes's eyes flashed, but before she could respond, Mr. Carter cleared his throat. The room fell silent as he rose from his seat, his expression measured but firm. "Miss Hayes," he began, his tone calm but carrying an unmistakable edge, "I'd like to ask a question." Miss Hayes turned to him, her professional facade cracking slightly. "Of course, Mr. Carter." "You've mentioned staying within the bounds of literary analysis," he said, his gaze steady. "Can you clarify what you mean by that? From what I've observed, Miss Anderson's analysis is both thorough and supported by evidence." Miss Hayes opened her mouth, then closed it, flustered. "Well, what I mean is, we should focus on the broader themes rather than individual interpretations." "And you believe themes of racial injustice and systemic power imbalances aren't part of the broader themes?" Mr. Carter asked, his tone pointed. Miss Hayes faltered, her face flushing. "I suppose they could be, but I feel they're being overemphasized." Mr. Carter's gaze sharpened. "I see. And would you say that to another student raising a similar point, or is this criticism reserved for Miss Anderson?" The classroom was silent, every student hanging on the exchange. Miss Hayes's lips tightened, and she avoided his eyes. "Of course not. I hold all students to the same standard." "Do you?" Mr. Carter's voice was calm, but the question hung heavy in the air. "Because from where I'm sitting, it appears that Miss Anderson has been held to a different standard, one that seems more personal than professional." Miss Hayes's composure cracked entirely and she stammered for a response. But Mr. Carter didn't wait. He turned to the class, his tone softening. Students, let this be a reminder. Education is about engaging with ideas even when they challenge us. It's not about dismissing perspectives that make us uncomfortable. He turned to Leah, his expression warm. Miss Anderson, thank you for your thoughtful analysis. Please continue. Leah's heart swelled with gratitude. She nodded, resuming her presentation with renewed confidence. By the time she finished, the room erupted in applause, not just for her work, but for her courage. Miss Hayes remained silent, her expression taut as the bell rang. But Leah knew this moment had shifted something fundamental. Her voice had been heard, and her resilience had exposed the truth. For Leah, this wasn't just a presentation, it was a victory. The principal's office at Westfield High, typically a place of quiet formality, buzzed with an electric tension. Mr. Julian Carter stood at his desk, a file folder in hand, his expression a mix of stern resolve and disappointment. Across from him sat Miss Margaret Hayes, her usual air of authority replaced by visible discomfort. Miss Hayes, Mr. Carter began, his tone calm but firm. We need to address the events of today and the larger concerns they've brought to light. Miss Hayes shifted in her chair, her hands gripping the armrests. Mr. Carter, I assure you there's been a misunderstanding. I hold all my students to the same high standards. Mr. Carter raised an eyebrow, flipping open the file. Do you? Because the reports and observations I've gathered suggest otherwise. Your treatment of Leah Anderson today is not an isolated incident. Miss Hayes paled slightly. I'm not sure what you mean. He leaned forward, placing the file on the desk. For weeks now, students have reported instances of microaggressions and outright dismissiveness in your classroom. These include interrupting certain students disproportionately, dismissing their ideas, and fostering an environment where others feel emboldened to follow your lead. Miss Hayes's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. This behavior is not just unprofessional, Mr. Carter continued, his voice sharper now. It's discriminatory. And today, in front of your students and myself, it was on full display. Before Miss Hayes could respond, Mr. Carter stood, his presence commanding. We'll finish this discussion in the classroom. It's important the students hear the truth. Miss Hayes blanched. Surely this isn't necessary. These matters are better handled privately. Mr. Carter's expression hardened. Your actions weren't private, Miss Hayes. The harm you've caused wasn't private. It's time the students understand the weight of what they've witnessed. The English classroom, still buzzing with the aftermath of Leah's presentation, fell silent as Mr. Carter entered, followed closely by Miss Hayes. The students sat straighter in their chairs, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Leah, still at her desk, met her father's gaze. He gave her a small, reassuring nod. Mr. Carter stood at the front of the room, his calm yet firm demeanor commanding the attention of everyone present. Miss Hayes remained by the door, her posture stiff, her face flushed. Students, Mr. Carter began, I'd like to take a moment to address what happened today and the environment that has been fostered in this classroom. The room was so quiet that the hum of the overhead lights seemed deafening. For weeks, he continued, there have been reports of behavior in this classroom that goes against the values of Westfield High, values of respect, inclusion, and fairness. Today's events have confirmed these reports. His gaze swept the room, lingering briefly on Leah, whose posture remained poised and steady. Leah Anderson's presentation on To Kill a Mockingbird was insightful, well-researched, and directly tied to the themes of justice and power in the text. Yet, it was repeatedly dismissed. Why? No one dared to speak. Even the students who had been complicit in Miss Hayes's behavior by laughing along or staying silent now looked down at their desks. Mr. Carter turned to Miss Hayes. Miss Hayes, do you have an answer for your students? Miss Hayes looked as though she might faint. Her voice, when it came, was a weak whisper. I didn't mean... It wasn't personal. Mr. Carter's gaze sharpened. Not personal? Then why, Miss Hayes, have multiple students reported feeling excluded or belittled in your classroom? Why has Leah Anderson in particular been the target of your interruptions and condescension? A murmur spread through the students. Sarah, who had spoken up earlier, raised her hand tentatively. Mr. Carter, it wasn't just today, we've all seen it. The way Miss Hayes treats Leah, it's different. It's not right. Another student, Marcus, nodded. Yeah, and we didn't say anything because we didn't want to get involved. But it's been obvious. Leah's heart swelled with a mix of emotions, gratitude for her peers' newfound courage, frustration at their earlier silence, and a profound sense of relief that the truth was finally being acknowledged. Mr. Carter turned back to Miss Hayes, whose face was now pale. It seems your students have noticed what you claim was not personal. Discrimination doesn't always come in overt acts. It often hides in the subtle ways we treat others, in the microaggressions we justify as standard. But those acts accumulate. They harm. They marginalize. He paused, letting his words sink in before addressing the class again. This moment is an opportunity for all of us. An opportunity to reflect on how our actions, or inactions, affect others. An opportunity to ensure that no one in this school feels less than because of their race, gender, background, or beliefs. The students nodded, many of them looking at Leah with newfound respect. Sarah raised her hand again. Mr. Carter, I think we should talk about what we can do to make things better. Like, maybe we could start a diversity and inclusion club? Leah looked at Sarah, surprised but encouraged. That's a great idea, she said softly. Mr. Carter smiled, his expression warm. I think that's an excellent idea, Sarah. Change begins when we acknowledge what's wrong and commit to making it right. He turned back to Miss Hayes, his tone cooling. Miss Hayes, your actions have had consequences. Effective immediately, you are suspended pending a full investigation. This school does not tolerate discrimination, and we will take the necessary steps to ensure a fair and inclusive environment for all our students. Miss Hayes's face crumpled as she nodded silently, gathering her things and exiting the classroom. Her absence was palpable, leaving a mixture of relief and somber reflection in its wake. After Miss Hayes's departure, the class broke into small groups, buzzing with ideas about how to foster a more inclusive atmosphere. Leah, at the center of it all, felt a sense of empowerment she hadn't experienced since joining the school. As the final bell rang, Mr. Carter approached Leah. I'm proud of you, he said quietly. Your courage brought about this change. Leah smiled. Thank you, Dad. I just hope it helps more than just me. Mr. Carter nodded. It will. This is just the beginning. As Leah left the classroom, her classmates followed, many of them offering words of support or apologies for their silence. The classroom that had once been a space of tension and exclusion now held the promise of change, a reckoning that had been long overdue. The grand auditorium of Westfield High hummed with energy as students and staff filed in, their voices a mix of curiosity and anticipation. On stage, a banner hung boldly across the stage reading, Seeds of Change, Building a Unified and Inclusive School Community. The assembly marked a pivotal moment for the school, an effort to reckon with its past and plant the foundations for a more equitable future. At the heart of it all was Leah Anderson, sitting quietly in the front row, her thoughts racing as she prepared to take the stage. In the weeks following Miss Hayes's suspension, the school had been abuzz with discussions about the events in the English classroom. While some whispered their disbelief at the teacher's actions, others expressed regret for their silence or complicity. For Leah, it was a strange and overwhelming time. She had spent so long being dismissed and ignored that the sudden attention, even if positive, felt surreal. Her father, Principal Julian Carter, had been a pillar of support. After the confrontation with Miss Hayes, he sat with Leah in his office, speaking candidly about what had happened and the changes that needed to follow. What happened in that classroom was a symptom of a deeper issue, he had said, his tone measured but resolute. We can't just stop at addressing Miss Hayes's behavior. We need to create a culture where this kind of discrimination doesn't take root in the first place. Leah had nodded, a spark of determination in her eyes. I want to help. I don't want what happened to me to happen to anyone else. Together they began planning initiatives to address the underlying biases that had gone unchecked for so long. The first major step was organizing a school-wide assembly to discuss inclusivity and announce new programs designed to foster understanding and empathy. As the auditorium filled, Leah scanned the crowd. Her classmates were scattered throughout the rows, chatting in hushed tones. Many of them had approached her over the past few weeks, offering apologies and pledging their support for the changes being discussed. Sarah, who had been one of the first to speak up in class, sat near the front, her notebook open and pen poised, ready to take notes. Leah's heart swelled as she spotted Marcus sitting a few rows back. He gave her a small nod of encouragement. She remembered how hesitant he had been to get involved at first, afraid of the social consequences of speaking out. Now, he was one of the most vocal advocates for change, helping to organize peer workshops and discussions. The lights dimmed and the murmurs of the audience faded as Principal Carter stepped onto the stage. His presence commanded attention, and the room fell silent as he approached the podium. "Good morning, students and staff," he began, his deep voice resonating through the auditorium. "Today, we're not just here to talk about what happened in one classroom. We're here to acknowledge a larger issue, one that affects not just our school but our society as a whole." He paused, letting his words sink in. Westfield High is a place of learning, growth, and community. But it cannot fulfill those purposes if any of our students feel excluded, dismissed, or marginalized. The events of the past month have shown us that we have work to do, not just to repair the harm that's been done, but to build something better. He gestured toward Leah, inviting her to join him on stage. The applause was hesitant at first, but it grew as Leah stood and walked to the podium. She glanced out at the sea of faces, her nerves momentarily threatening to overwhelm her. Then she took a deep breath and began to speak. "When I first came to Westfield High," Leah began, her voice steady, "I didn't expect it to be easy. I knew I might face challenges because of who I am. What I didn't expect was how those challenges would make me feel. Small, invisible, unwelcome." The audience was silent, many students leaning forward in their seats, hanging on her words. "But something happened," Leah continued, her voice growing stronger. "When I was silenced, I realized I had to speak louder. When I was dismissed, I decided to stand taller. And when I felt alone, I found people who stood with me." She turned to look at her classmates in the front rows. "This isn't just my story. It's about all of us. It's about the choices we make every day. To speak up, to listen, and to act with empathy. It's about creating a school where everyone feels seen, heard, and valued." Leah stepped back and the room erupted into applause. She caught Sarah's eye and saw her friend beaming with pride. Even Marcus was clapping enthusiastically, a look of admiration on his face. Over the next hour, Principal Carter and Leah unveiled a series of initiatives designed to transform the school's culture. The first was a mentorship program pairing students from different backgrounds to foster understanding and collaboration. "Mentorship isn't just about academics," Principal Carter explained. "It's about building relationships and breaking down the walls that divide us." Next, they announced the formation of a diversity and inclusion committee, which would include students, teachers, and parents. The committee's goal was to review school policies, curriculum, and events to ensure they reflected the values of equity and respect. Sarah raised her hand during the Q&A session that followed. "Can we also have workshops or guest speakers? I think it would help if we learned about different cultures and experiences directly from people who've lived them." Leah smiled, nodding in agreement. "That's a great idea, Sarah, and I think it's something the committee can help organize." As the assembly concluded, students began signing up to join the mentorship program and committee. Leah watched in awe as classmates who had once seemed indifferent now eagerly volunteered to be part of the change. Marcus stood at the sign-up table, encouraging others to join. "We can't undo what's happened," Leah said later to Sarah as they helped organize the sign-up sheets. "But seeing everyone come together like this, it gives me hope." Sarah nodded, her expression earnest. "You've inspired us, Leah. This wouldn't have happened without you." Leah shook her head. It's not just me, it's all of us deciding we can do better. In the weeks that followed, the changes at Westfield High became increasingly evident. Students who had once avoided conversations about race and bias now actively participated in discussions. The mentorship program brought unlikely pairs together, creating friendships that bridged cultural and social divides. Leah, now a key member of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee, worked tirelessly alongside her father and peers to ensure the initiative succeeded. She helped organize the school's first Cultural Awareness Week, featuring workshops, guest speakers, and performances celebrating the diverse backgrounds of the student body. During one workshop, Marcus stood up to share his own reflections. "I used to think speaking out didn't matter," he admitted. "But Leah showed me that staying silent makes you part of the problem. I'm still learning, but I want to be better." Leah felt a swell of pride as the room erupted in applause. Moments like this reminded her why the work was worth it. One afternoon, Leah and her father sat together in his office reviewing plans for the next phase of their initiatives. "You've done so much, Leah," Principal Carter said, his voice filled with pride. "But there's still more to do." Leah nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "I know. But for the first time, I feel like we're moving in the right direction." Her father smiled. "You've planted seeds of change here, Leah, and they're already starting to grow." As she left his office and walked through the halls, Leah noticed the differences. Students who had once avoided her now greeted her warmly. Conversations about diversity and inclusion were no longer whispered but spoken openly. The school felt lighter, more welcoming. Leah knew the road ahead would still be challenging. Change was never easy, and there would always be those who resisted. But as she looked around at the community she had helped create, she felt a deep sense of hope. Together, they were proving that even in the face of adversity, growth was possible. Westfield High was no longer just a school, it was a place where everyone could belong, a place where the seeds of change had taken root and would continue to flourish. The auditorium at Westfield High buzzed with chatter and laughter as alumni and current students gathered for the school's annual reunion. The room was adorned with photographs spanning decades, capturing the evolution of the school and its students. At the center of it all was a display celebrating the school's initiatives on diversity and inclusion, an effort that had transformed Westfield High into a model of equity and understanding. Leah Anderson, now in her early 30s and a prominent civil rights attorney, stood at the edge of the crowd. Her tailored suit exuded professionalism, but her warm smile and bright eyes reflected her excitement to return to the school that had profoundly shaped her path. This time she wasn't here as a student fighting for her place. She was here to inspire others. As the evening program began, Principal Julian Carter, still serving as the school's leader, took the stage to introduce the keynote speaker. His voice was rich with pride as he addressed the crowd. "Tonight we celebrate not only the achievements of our alumni, but also the values that make Westfield High a place where every student can thrive. Our keynote speaker embodies those values. Her courage, resilience, and dedication to justice have left an indelible mark on this school and beyond." He turned to Leah, gesturing for her to join him. The room erupted in applause as she stepped onto the stage. Scanning the audience, Leah spotted familiar faces, her former classmates, teachers, and even some students who had joined the school long after her time there. She took a deep breath and began. "Good evening, everyone." Leah began, her voice clear and steady. "It's humbling to stand here tonight, in this very auditorium where so much of my journey began. When I first walked into Westfield High, I never imagined I'd be standing here sharing my story with all of you." The audience quieted, their attention rapt. "My time here wasn't easy," she continued. "There were moments when I felt invisible, moments when I was silenced or dismissed. But there were also moments of clarity, moments that taught me the power of my voice and the importance of standing up for what's right." Leah's thoughts drifted to Miss Hayes's classroom, the tension that had simmered there and the courage it took to confront it. What happened in that classroom all those years ago was a turning point, not just for me, but for our school. It exposed the cracks in our community and forced us to face uncomfortable truths. But it also showed us what we're capable of when we come together to create change." She paused, letting her words sink in. Leah's speech transitioned into stories of her classmates and their growth. What's most remarkable to me isn't just how that experience shaped my life, but how it sparked something in all of us. I've seen how my peers have taken what we learned and used it to make an impact in their own ways. She gestured toward the audience. Take Marcus, for example. Back then, he was hesitant to speak out. But today, he's a community organizer, helping marginalized voices find their power. Marcus, sitting a few rows back, grinned sheepishly as the audience applauded. And Sarah, Leah continued, smiling toward the front row, she was the first to break the silence in that classroom. Now she's a teacher herself, working to create inclusive and empowering environments for her students. Sarah blushed as the crowd cheered. Leah's gaze swept the room. Each of us carried the lessons of that time into our lives. Together, we've built something lasting, a legacy that continues to grow with every new generation of students at Westfield High. Leah turned her focus to the school's current students. To those of you sitting in these seats today, I want you to know that you are the stewards of this legacy. The work we started isn't finished. Every time you speak up for someone who feels unheard, every time you challenge an injustice, you are planting seeds for the future. Her voice grew stronger. Justice isn't a destination, it's a journey. And it's a journey we all take together. The audience erupted into applause, the room filled with an energy that felt both celebratory and determined. Leah stepped back, nodding toward her father, who beamed with pride as he took the podium to close the evening. After the formal program ended, the room buzzed with conversations. Leah found herself surrounded by old classmates and new students alike, all eager to share how her story had impacted them. One young woman, a current student named Emily, approached her hesitantly. "Ms. Anderson," she began, "I just wanted to thank you. Hearing what you went through and how you stood up to it, it makes me feel like I can make a difference too." Leah smiled warmly. "You absolutely can, Emily. Change starts with believing in your own power to create it." As the night wound down, Leah stepped outside, the crisp evening air a welcome reprieve. Her father joined her, his expression thoughtful. "You've come a long way, Leah," he said quietly. Leah nodded, her gaze drifting toward the school building. "We've come a long way, Dad. None of this would have happened without your support, or without the people who stood with me." Julian Carter placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder. "And you've ensured that this isn't just about one moment or one person. You've created something that will last." Leah looked back at the illuminated auditorium where students and alumni still lingered, laughing and sharing stories. It was a far cry from the tense, divided classroom she remembered. The seeds of change she had planted had grown into something beautiful, a thriving, inclusive community where everyone had a place. "I used to think that justice was about fighting battles and winning," Leah said, her voice soft. "But now I realize it's about creating spaces where battles don't need to be fought at all." Her father smiled. "And that's exactly what you've done." As they walked back toward the building, Leah felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The road ahead would always have challenges, but Westfield High had shown her that change was possible, and that even the smallest acts of courage could ripple outward, transforming lives and communities. Her story had become part of the school's foundation, a touchstone for students and teachers alike. And as she looked toward the future, Leah felt confident that the seeds of justice and equality she had sown would continue to grow for generations to come. As we reflect on Leah's story, let's remember this. Real change starts when we choose to confront injustice, to stand up for what's right, and to lift others as we rise. Together, we can build communities where everyone feels valued, heard, and empowered. If Leah's story inspired you, let's keep the conversation going. Share your thoughts, your stories, and your dreams for a more just world in the comments below. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button to join us for more stories of courage, hope, and transformation. Your voice matters, and together we can make a difference.